Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a room filled with everything you've ever wanted. Picture it in vivid detail. Shelves lined with possessions, accounts overflowing with numbers that represent security, drawers stuffed with objects you once convinced yourself you needed. Now imagine standing in the center of this room, and despite being surrounded by abundance, feeling a hollow ache, a persistent whisper that says it's not quite enough. This is the great paradox of human greed, a peculiar feature of our species that has puzzled philosophers, theologians, scientists, and ordinary people for thousands of years. Why do we, alone among all creatures on this planet, seem capable of wanting more than we could ever possibly need or use? Why does the accumulation of wealth, possessions, and resources so often fail to bring the satisfaction we imagine it will? And most mysteriously, why does this hunger seem to intensify rather than diminish as we acquire more? Welcome to this exploration of one of humanity's most perplexing characteristics. Over the next several hours, we'll journey through time and across cultures, examining greed from every angle we can imagine. Evolutionary, psychological, philosophical, spiritual, and social. We'll hear from ancient wisdom traditions and modern neuroscience, from economists and mystics, from those who have studied human behavior in laboratories and those who have observed it in the quiet reflection of contemplative practice. This is designed to be both a learning experience and a companion for sleep. So if you drift off at any point, know that this is exactly as it should be. There's no need to stay awake for every word. Let your mind wander where it will, and let sleep come naturally when it's ready. The mystery of human greed has been with us for millennia. It will still be here tomorrow, if you'd like to return. To understand why humans seem uniquely prone to greed, we must first travel back in time, far back, to the very beginnings of human civilization. The story begins not with moral failing, but with a profound transformation in how our ancestors lived. For most of human history, spanning hundreds of thousands of years, our species existed as hunter-gatherers, moving in small bands across landscapes, following the seasonal availability of food and resources. In this context, accumulation made little sense. You cannot hoard meat that will spoil in days, and carrying excess possessions is a burden when your home is wherever you make camp that night. Archaeological evidence suggests that these early humans lived in societies characterized by remarkable egalitarianism and resource sharing. The social bonds of the group depended on reciprocity and mutual aid, and the inability to store surplus meant that wealth as we understand it today simply couldn't exist. But approximately 12,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. In multiple locations around the world, independently and at different times, human groups began to domesticate plants and animals. This agricultural revolution, which occurred in Mesopotamia, the Yellow River Valley, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, and other places, fundamentally altered the equation. For the first time in human history, it became possible to produce more food than was immediately needed. Surplus could be stored. Grain could be kept for months or years. Herds could be grown beyond what was necessary for immediate consumption. This changed everything. The earliest evidence we have of what we might call institutionalized greed comes from ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. in what is now Iraq. Here, in the Fertile Crescent, the Sumerians developed one of the world's first complex civilizations around 4000 BCE. With agriculture came settlement. With settlement came specialization. And with specialization came hierarchy. Not everyone needed to produce food anymore, which meant that some people could accumulate the surplus produced by others. The archaeological record from this period shows increasing differentiation in burial goods, with some graves containing vast wealth, while others contain almost nothing. The cuneiform tablets that survive from this era, humanity's earliest writing, are largely concerned with accounting, with keeping track of who owned what, who owed what, to whom. The very invention of writing appears to have been driven significantly by the need to record property and transactions. In these early Mesopotamian city-states, we see the emergence of what would become familiar patterns throughout human history. Temple complexes and palaces accumulated enormous stores of grain, oil, and precious materials. Kings and priests controlled these surpluses and used them to extend their power. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving stories, dating to around 2100 BCE, tells of a king obsessed with achieving immortality and accumulating glory. The concern with legacy, with leaving behind something that will outlast one's mortal span, is intimately connected with the acquisitive impulse. If we cannot take our possessions with us into death, perhaps we can at least ensure that we are remembered through monuments, through accumulated achievements, through the wealth we've gathered. The Code of Hammurabi, created around 1750 BCE, provides a window into how these early civilizations attempted to regulate the consequences of material inequality and acquisitive behavior. The code specifies different punishments depending on social class and includes numerous provisions about property, debt, and commercial transactions. What's striking about reading these ancient laws is how familiar many of the problems sound. People defaulting on debts, disputes over property boundaries, merchants accused of dishonest dealing. The basic template of greed-driven conflict was already well established nearly 4,000 years ago. The accumulation of surplus had created new possibilities for human society, but it had also introduced new forms of suffering, new kinds of injustice, new sources of conflict. But why did humans respond to the possibility of surplus by hoarding it, rather than simply enjoying enough and sharing the rest? This question takes us into the realm of evolutionary biology and psychology. Our brains, after all, evolved over millions of years in environments vastly different from the civilizations we've created. To understand the biological roots of greed, we need to understand the challenges our ancestors faced and the solutions that natural selection favored. For most of our evolutionary history, scarcity was the defining feature of existence. Food was unreliable, winters were harsh, injuries and illnesses could be catastrophic. In this environment, the individuals who survived and passed on their genes were often those who, when resources were available, took more than they immediately needed. The psychological mechanism that made our ancestors gather extra food when it was abundant, that made them seek out and protect valuable resources like tool-making materials or sheltered living spaces, was adaptive. It increased survival and reproductive success. Natural selection doesn't optimize for happiness or contentment. It optimizes for survival and reproduction. If a tendency to accumulate resources when possible increased the chances of surviving lean times and raising offspring successfully, then that tendency would spread through the population, becoming a fundamental part of human psychology. The problem, of course, is that this mechanism has no built-in enough signal that matches our modern context. The brain systems that rewarded our ancestors for gathering extra berries or securing a second shelter don't automatically turn off when we have full pantries and retirement accounts. They keep pushing us to acquire more because, in the environment where they evolved, more was almost always better. Modern neuroscience has begun to map the brain systems involved in wanting and getting rewards. When we acquire something we desire, whether it's food, money, or status, our brain releases dopamine, a neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and motivation. But here's the crucial insight from recent research. The dopamine system responds more strongly to the anticipation of reward than to the reward itself, and it responds most strongly to unpredictable rewards. This is why gambling can be so addictive. The uncertainty of the outcome creates powerful dopamine surges. This is also why the pursuit of wealth can become so all-consuming. The anticipation of the next acquisition, the next promotion, the next financial milestone, triggers reward circuits in ways that the actual achievement often doesn't. Once we obtain what we sought, the pleasure fades quickly, and we begin to focus on the next goal. This is the neurological basis of what psychologists call the hedonic treadmill, the tendency to return to a baseline level of happiness, regardless of positive or negative events. Research in behavioral economics has demonstrated another relevant feature of human psychology: loss aversion. Studies by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky showed that people feel the pain of loss roughly twice as intensely as they feel the pleasure of equivalent gains. This asymmetry makes evolutionary sense in an environment of scarcity. Losing a crucial resource could mean death, while gaining extra resources might provide only a marginal benefit. But in modern contexts, loss aversion can contribute to hoarding behavior and the anxious protection of wealth. The fear of losing what we have can drive us to seek ever more, trying to build an unassailable buffer against potential loss. There's also the matter of social comparison. Humans are intensely social creatures, and much of our sense of self is derived from our position within social hierarchies. Experiments have shown that people often care more about relative wealth than absolute wealth. In one famous study, participants were asked whether they'd prefer to earn $50,000 a year when others earn $25,000, or earn $100,000 when others earn $200,000. Many people chose the first option, preferring to have less in absolute terms but more relative to others. This makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, where social status often determined access to mates and resources. But it creates a situation where enough is always defined relative to what others have, making true satisfaction impossible in an unequal society. The combination of these factors, the adaptive value of accumulation in scarce environments, the dopamine-driven anticipation of reward, loss aversion, and social comparison, creates a powerful psychological foundation for what we call greed. But biology is not destiny. Different cultures have channeled these tendencies in vastly different ways, and human societies have developed sophisticated philosophical and spiritual frameworks for understanding and moderating the acquisitive impulse. Moving from the biological to the philosophical, we encounter some of humanity's earliest systematic reflections on greed and its dangers. Ancient Greek philosophy, particularly in Athens during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, devoted considerable attention to what the Greeks called pleonexia, a word that's difficult to translate precisely but captures the idea of wanting more than one's share, of overreaching one's proper bounds. This concept was central to Greek ethical thought because it was seen as threatening the social order and individual flourishing alike. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, saw greed as a fundamental threat to the ideal society he envisioned in his republic. In his tripartite model of the soul, he described the appetitive part, which desires food, drink, sex, and material goods, as the lowest and largest part, like a many-headed beast that must be controlled by reason and spirit. For Plato, the well-ordered soul was one in which reason ruled over appetite, and he extended this model to the state, arguing that the ideal society would be one in which the rational philosopher kings governed, warriors protected, and workers produced, each class knowing its place and not grasping for more than its proper role. Greed represented a failure of reason to govern desire, allowing the appetitive part of the soul to dominate. In the myth of that concludes the Republic, Plato describes souls choosing their next lives, and those who had lived unjustly often chose lives of tyranny and wealth, not understanding that such lives would bring misery. The greedy person, in Plato's view, was fundamentally confused about what would make them happy, mistaking the satisfaction of appetite for genuine flourishing. Aristotle, Plato's student, approached the question differently but with similar conclusions about the dangers of excessive acquisition. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argued that virtue lay in the mean between extremes, and he applied this framework to wealth. The virtue related to money was liberality, the proper disposition toward giving and receiving wealth, which lay between stinginess and wastefulness. But Aristotle was particularly concerned with what he called chrematistics, the art of wealth-getting, which he divided into natural and unnatural forms. Natural wealth-getting, in his view, involved acquiring what one needed for household management and the good life, enough resources to support one's family and fulfill one's role as a citizen. Unnatural wealth-getting was the pursuit of wealth for its own sake, particularly through trade and money lending, where the goal became the endless accumulation of currency rather than the acquisition of useful goods. Aristotle saw this unnatural form as particularly corrupting because it had no inherent limit. There's no natural stopping point in the accumulation of money as there is in the accumulation of, say, grain or clothing. You can only use so much grain, but there's no amount of money that inherently constitutes enough. This philosophical concern with limits and proper measure was not unique to Greece. Around the same time that Plato and Aristotle were teaching in Athens, on the other side of the Eurasian continent, the Buddha was addressing the same fundamental issues from a different angle. Buddhism, which emerged in northern India in the 6th century BCE, placed the problem of desire at the very center of its analysis of human suffering. The second noble truth of Buddhism identifies tanha, typically translated as craving or thirst, as the origin of dukkha, suffering, or unsatisfactoriness. This craving takes three primary forms: craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence or becoming, and craving for non-existence. Greed, in Buddhist understanding, is a particular manifestation of tanha, the thirst for sensory and material experiences. What makes the Buddhist analysis particularly sophisticated is its emphasis on the mental formations and habits that sustain craving. Buddhist psychology describes how attachment arises through a process of misperceiving phenomena as permanent, satisfying, and constituting a self. We encounter something pleasant, perhaps a beautiful object, or the feeling of having money, and we cling to it, wanting it to last, wanting more of it, building our identity around it. This clinging is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of reality, according to Buddhist teaching, because all phenomena are actually impermanent, ultimately unsatisfying, and empty of inherent self-nature. Greed arises when we fail to see this truth clearly, when we imagine that external acquisitions can provide lasting happiness or fill the sense of lack we feel inside. The Buddhist path offers a systematic training to overcome greed through ethical discipline, meditative concentration, and wisdom. The monastic rules include specific provisions about the number of robes a monk may possess, the kind of bowl they may use, and prohibitions against handling money, all designed to minimize opportunities for attachment and accumulation. For lay people, Buddhism teaches generosity as the first of the paramitas, or perfections, understanding that the practice of giving freely weakens the grip of possessiveness and opens the heart. There are numerous stories in Buddhist literature about the consequences of greed, like the tale of the hungry ghosts, beings with enormous bellies and tiny mouths who can never satisfy their hunger, a vivid metaphor for the insatiability of greed. Moving westward from India into the Mediterranean world, we find another philosophical tradition that grappled with desire and its proper limits: Stoicism. The Stoic philosophers, who emerged in Athens around 300 BCE, and whose influence spread throughout the Roman world, took a different approach than either the Platonists or the Buddhists, though they shared many similar conclusions. The Stoics distinguished between what was within our control, primarily our judgments and responses, and what was outside our control, including external events, other people's actions, and material circumstances. The key to a good life, they argued, was to focus our attention and effort on what we control, while accepting with equanimity what we don't. For the Stoics, greed was a kind of category error, a misunderstanding of where value really resides. Wealth, they taught, was one of the preferred indifferents, things that are neither intrinsically good nor bad, but that we might reasonably prefer to have rather than not have, all else being equal. But making wealth into a final goal, something we believe we need for happiness, was a fundamental mistake. The true goods, the Stoics maintained, were virtues, wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation, qualities of character that were entirely within our control and that could not be taken from us by fortune. Epictetus, a former slave who became one of the most influential Stoic teachers in the 1st century CE, taught that we should think of external things as though they were borrowed, to be used gratefully while we have them, but returned without complaint when circumstances change. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, reminded himself in his meditations to think often on the transience of all things, how even the mightiest empires crumble, how the richest fortunes are dispersed, how everything we accumulate will one day pass to others and eventually turn to dust. The Stoic approach to greed, then, was to see through it, to recognize that the desperate grasping for external things was based on the false belief that our well-being depended on them. By training ourselves to see wealth and poverty, honor and dishonor as genuinely indifferent to our true happiness, we could free ourselves from the tyranny of desire and live with a kind of invulnerable contentment. This didn't mean the Stoics thought we should be passive. or that we shouldn't engage in productive work or manage resources wisely. Rather, they taught that we should do what seemed appropriate to our circumstances and roles, while remaining internally detached from outcomes, neither elated by success nor devastated by loss. In ancient China, roughly contemporary with these Greek and Indian developments, yet another set of philosophical perspectives on greed was emerging. Confucianism, associated with Confucius or Confucius, who lived in the 6th century BCE, emphasized the cultivation of virtue within a framework of proper social relationships and roles. Confucius recognized that people had material needs and that seeking adequate resources for oneself and one's family was legitimate and even necessary. The problem came when the pursuit of profit overshadowed the cultivation of righteousness, when people lost sight of ethical principles in their quest for wealth. Confucius taught that the superior person understands righteousness, while the small person understands only profit, and he warned that when gain became the primary motivation, society would fall into disorder. One of the key Confucian virtues was yi, often translated as righteousness or justice, which involved knowing what was proper in a given situation and acting accordingly, regardless of personal advantage. The Confucian approach involved finding a balance, neither withdrawing from the material world entirely, nor making wealth the center of one's concerns. A person could be wealthy and virtuous if they acquired their wealth through proper means and used it appropriately, supporting their family, contributing to social stability, and fulfilling their obligations. What was condemned was not wealth itself, but the greed that led people to violate social bonds, cheat in business, neglect their duties to family and state, or trample on others in pursuit of gain. The Confucian ideal was someone who found satisfaction in simple living and the practice of virtue, whose contentment didn't depend on external circumstances. Confucius himself was said to have lived modestly, finding joy in learning and teaching. And when a disciple suggested that he must sometimes wish for wealth, he replied that if wealth could be obtained in an honorable way, he would pursue it. But since it couldn't, he preferred to follow his own inclinations. Taoism, the other major philosophical tradition of ancient China, took an even more radical stance toward acquisition and ambition. The Tao Te Ching, attributed to Lao Tzu and composed sometime between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE, is filled with warnings about the dangers of desire and accumulation. It teaches that the sage knows contentment and therefore is never disappointed, that those who know when to stop don't find themselves in danger, that the world's problem arise from action while solution comes through wu-wei, effortless action or non-striving. The Taoist view saw desire and ambition as forces that distort the natural order, pulling us away from harmony with the Tao, the underlying principle of the universe. By reducing desires and embracing simplicity, one could return to a natural state of sufficiency. The Taoist sages often lived as hermits, deliberately choosing poverty and obscurity, seeing in them a freedom that wealth and fame could never provide. These ancient philosophical traditions, despite emerging independently across different civilizations, arrived at remarkably similar conclusions about greed. Whether we look at Greek philosophy, Buddhism, Stoicism, Confucianism, or Taoism, we find a consistent message that the unrestrained pursuit of material gain is both psychologically unhealthy and socially destructive, that true satisfaction comes not from external acquisition, but from internal cultivation. and that wisdom involves understanding what is truly necessary and sufficient. The specific metaphysics and practices vary widely, but the core insight remains constant across cultures. This widespread recognition suggests something important, that the problem of greed is not merely a cultural construct, but a genuine feature of human experience that thoughtful people in diverse contexts have recognized and grappled with. As these philosophical traditions were developing, religious frameworks were also emerging that addressed greed from a different angle, embedding their insights in narratives of divine command, cosmic justice, and ultimate accountability. These religious perspectives added a new dimension to the understanding of greed by linking it to fundamental questions of meaning, purpose, and relationship with the transcendent. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, greed appears as one of the 7 deadly sins, sometimes called avarice or covetousness, and its condemnation runs throughout both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament. The 10th commandment explicitly prohibits coveting, desiring what belongs to another, recognizing that the internal disposition of greed is dangerous even before it manifests in action. The Hebrew prophets repeatedly denounced the wealthy who accumulated land and possessions at the expense of the poor. Isaiah declared woe to those who join house to house and field to field until there's no room and they dwell alone in the land. Amos condemned those who trample on the needy and bring ruin to the poor of the land, who use dishonest scales and sell the needy for a pair of sandals. The prophetic tradition saw economic justice as inseparable from faithfulness to God, understanding that how we treat others in material matters is a direct expression of our spiritual condition. The prophets envisioned a society where debts would be forgiven, where the land would be redistributed, where the vulnerable would be protected, a radical vision that stood in stark contrast to the accumulation-driven empires surrounding Israel. In the New Testament, Jesus' teachings on wealth are even more challenging and countercultural. He declared that it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God, a hyperbolic statement that shocked his disciples and continues to discomfort comfortable Christians today. He told his followers not to store up treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal, but rather to store up treasures in heaven. He warned that no one can serve 2 masters. You cannot serve both God and mammon. Wealth. The parable of the rich fool tells of a man who accumulated so much that he had to build bigger barns to store his grain, who planned to retire and take his ease, only to be told that night his life would be required of him. The parable of the rich man and Lazarus depicts a wealthy man who ignored the poor beggar at his gate, and who, after death, finds himself in torment, while Lazarus is comforted. The early Christian community in Jerusalem, as described in the book of Acts, practiced a form of communal living, where believers held all things in common and distributed to each as any had need, an experiment in eliminating greed through radical sharing. The Christian theological tradition developed a sophisticated analysis of greed as a spiritual disease. The Church Fathers and medieval theologians understood greed not simply as wanting things, but as a disordered love, a making ultimate what should be only penultimate, a turning toward created things and away from the Creator. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th and 5th centuries, described all sin as ultimately arising from disordered loves, and he saw the love of money and possessions as paradigmatic of the soul turned away from God. Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, analyzed greed as a capital vice, one of the 7 deadly sins from which many other sins flow. He explained that greed involved an excessive desire for wealth, where excessive meant beyond what reason dictates we need. Aquinas distinguished between the natural need for material goods, which is legitimate, and the inordinate desire for them, which constitutes greed. He noted that greed was particularly dangerous because wealth is a universal means to all sorts of other temporal goods. So the greedy person is susceptible to all sorts of other sins in pursuit of gain. Islam, which emerged in 7th century Arabia, similarly placed strict moral constraints on the pursuit of wealth while recognizing the legitimacy of property and commerce. The Quran repeatedly condemns hoarding and excessive attachment to wealth, warning that those who hoard gold and silver and don't spend them in the way of Allah will face punishment. At the same time, Islam established zakat, obligatory almsgiving, as one of the 5 pillars of the faith. Every Muslim of sufficient means is required to give a specified percentage of their wealth annually to support the poor and other designated beneficiaries. This institution recognizes that wealth is ultimately a trust from God, not an absolute possession, and that those who have been blessed with resources have obligations to those in need. Islamic economic teaching develops sophisticated rules to prevent exploitation, while allowing commerce to flourish. The prohibition of riba, often translated as usury or interest but more broadly understood as unfair gain in exchange, was meant to prevent the accumulation of wealth through exploitation of the vulnerable. The emphasis on honest dealing, fair weights and measures, and the fulfillment of contracts created a framework where economic activity could serve social welfare rather than pure individual enrichment. The Prophet Muhammad himself was a merchant, and Islam never denigrated honest work or reasonable profit. What it condemned was the attachment to wealth that eclipsed concern for others and forgetfulness of God, the using of economic advantage to oppress rather than to uplift, the allowing of material concerns to dominate one's life and heart. Hinduism, the diverse religious tradition of the Indian subcontinent, offers yet another framework for understanding greed within the context of a cosmic moral order. The concept of Maya, often translated as illusion, helps explain the Hindu view of attachment to material things. The phenomenal world, according to many Hindu philosophical schools, is Maya, not in the sense of being unreal, but in the sense of being impermanent and misleading about the true nature of reality. When we become attached to wealth and possessions, taking them to be ultimately real and important, we are caught in Maya, mistaking the temporary for the permanent, the superficial for the profound. The Bhagavad Gita, one of Hinduism's most beloved texts, teaches about different paths to liberation, including karma yoga, the path of selfless action. In this approach, one continues to work and act in the world, but without attachment to the fruits of one's actions, performing one's duty without grasping for results. This allows for material engagement without greed, activity without acquisitiveness. The Hindu caste system, whatever its problematic social consequences, embodied a theory about how to organize society so that different people could pursue appropriate aims at different life stages, without everyone being driven by the same acquisitive motives. The Brahmins were to pursue knowledge and spiritual goals rather than wealth. The Kshatriyas were to pursue honor and duty. The Vaishyas were permitted to pursue economic success, and the Shudras were to provide service within an individual's life. The ashrama system prescribed 4 stages: the student, the householder, the forest dweller, and the renunciant. The householder stage, when one raised a family and engaged in economic activity, was the appropriate time for material concerns, but it was meant to give way eventually to a life of reduced materialism and increased spiritual focus. The underlying idea was that not everyone should be acquisitive all the time, that different values should govern at different times and for different roles, and that the ultimate goal was liberation from material attachment, not endless accumulation. Indigenous traditions around the world have also developed cultural practices that limit greed and promote sharing, often in ways quite different from the agricultural civilizations we've been discussing. Many hunter-gatherer and horticultural societies maintained strong norms against accumulation and boasting about possessions. Among the Kung people of southern Africa, for instance, anthropologists documented elaborate practices of insulting the meat brought in by successful hunters, deliberately diminishing the accomplishment to prevent pride and ensure that the food would be shared generously. The potlatch ceremonies of Pacific Northwest indigenous peoples involved lavish feasts where hosts gave away or even destroyed valuable goods to demonstrate their status, a system that redistributed wealth and prevented permanent accumulation. Many Native American traditions emphasize the importance of giveaway ceremonies where people distributed their possessions to others, understanding that prestige came not from what you kept, but from what you gave away. These practices embodied fundamentally different economic logics than the accumulation-focused systems that came to dominate much of the world. The variety of religious and spiritual responses to greed, from Judeo-Christian prophecy and teaching to Islamic economic rules, from Hindu concepts of Maya and Dharma to indigenous sharing practices, demonstrates that virtually every human culture has recognized greed as a problem and has developed frameworks to constrain it. The specific theological justifications and practical mechanisms vary enormously, but the underlying concern remains consistent. This ubiquity suggests, again, that we're dealing with something fundamental to human nature, a tendency so powerful and so potentially destructive that societies have felt compelled to develop elaborate cultural and religious technologies to manage it. As we move from these ancient and traditional perspectives into the modern era, the understanding of greed becomes more complex, incorporating insights from psychology, sociology, economics, and neuroscience, while also witnessing dramatic changes in how greed manifests in society. The development of capitalism as the dominant economic system, the rise of consumer culture, the acceleration of wealth inequality, all of these transformations have created new contexts in which the old problem of human avarice plays out in unprecedented ways. Modern psychology has approached greed as a complex interaction between personality, cognition, and social context. Early psychoanalytic theory, particularly Sigmund Freud's work, connected adult character traits to childhood developmental stages, suggesting that excessive fixation on accumulation and retention might stem from unresolved issues during the anal stage of development. While this specific theory hasn't held up well to empirical scrutiny, it pointed toward the important insight that adult patterns of desire and control have roots in early experience and emotional development. Contemporary psychological research has identified greed as related to a cluster of personality traits and cognitive patterns. People who score high on measures of materialism, for instance, tend to believe that acquiring possessions and wealth is essential for happiness and success, and they organize their lives around these goals. Research has consistently found that highly materialistic people report lower life satisfaction, more anxiety and depression, and worse relationships than less materialistic people, even when controlling for actual wealth. This is the paradox of materialism. The very mindset that drives the pursuit of material goods undermines the well-being those goods are supposed to provide. The psychologist Tim Kasser, who has studied materialism extensively, suggests that materialistic values arise partly as a coping mechanism for insecurity and low self-esteem. When people feel uncertain about their worth or their place in the world, material possessions can seem like a way to establish value and gain recognition. But because this strategy doesn't address the underlying insecurity, it leads to a cycle of acquisition that never brings lasting satisfaction. The phenomenon of social comparison plays a crucial role in modern greed. Thorstein Veblen, writing in the late 19th century, coined the term conspicuous consumption to describe how people purchase goods not for their utility, but to display their wealth and status. In contemporary society, with its intense exposure to media images of luxury and celebrity lifestyle, social comparison has been amplified to an unprecedented degree. We're constantly shown images of people who have more than we do, and algorithms on social media platforms are optimized to show us content that provokes engagement, including envy. Research has shown that heavy social media use is associated with increased materialism and decreased life satisfaction, partly because of the comparison processes it triggers. When we compare ourselves to those who have more, which is what advertising and social media encourage us to do constantly, we're likely to feel that what we have is inadequate, regardless of its objective abundance. The hedonic treadmill, mentioned earlier in the context of neuroscience, has been studied extensively by psychologists interested in happiness and well-being. The basic finding is that people quickly adapt to changes in their circumstances, returning to a relatively stable baseline of happiness. This applies to windfalls as well as to catastrophes. Lottery winners, after an initial period of excitement, typically return to approximately their previous level of life satisfaction within a year or two. What this means for greed is sobering. The things we think will make us happy if only we could acquire them, the salary increase, the bigger house, the luxury car, provide only temporary boosts in satisfaction before we adapt and begin wanting the next thing. The hedonic treadmill helps explain why there's no natural satiation point for material desires in modern consumer society. Each acquisition brings a brief spike of pleasure followed by adaptation and renewed wanting, creating a cycle that can continue indefinitely. Psychologists have also studied the specific circumstances that tend to trigger or intensify greedy behavior. Experiments have shown that when people are primed to think about money, even subliminally, they become less helpful, more self-focused, and more likely to act in their narrow self-interest. The mere presence of money-related words or images appears to activate a mindset of self-sufficiency and reduced social obligation. Other research has found that people in positions of power and privilege tend to become less empathetic and more entitled over time, a pattern that can reinforce and justify acquisitive behavior. There's also evidence that income inequality itself affects social psychology. In more unequal societies, people report higher levels of anxiety, more concern with status, and more materialistic values. The psychologists Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett have documented how inequality doesn't just leave poor people worse off, but creates social problems across the entire society, including increased stress, reduced trust, and intensified status competition that manifests partly as intensified greed. The sociological perspective adds another layer to our understanding by examining how social structures and cultural systems shape individual psychology and behavior. The rise of capitalism as the dominant economic system represents a watershed in how greed functions in society. Pre-capitalist economic systems, whether feudal, tributary, or communal, certainly involved exploitation and inequality, but they didn't celebrate the endless accumulation of wealth as a positive good in itself. Capitalism, by contrast, is premised on the idea that the pursuit of profit by individuals and firms will, through market mechanisms, lead to overall prosperity and innovation. Adam Smith's famous notion of the invisible hand suggested that individuals pursuing their self-interest would unintentionally promote the public good. This represented a dramatic moral reframing. What had previously been understood as a vice, greed, was now presented as a potential engine of social benefit. The sociologist Max Weber, in his classic work The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, argued that the development of capitalism was closely connected to certain religious ideas, particularly the Calvinist notion of predestination and the doctrine of calling. According to Weber, Protestant theology, especially in its Calvinist forms, created an anxiety about salvation that was channeled into worldly work, with success in business being taken as a sign of being among the elect. This led to an ethic of accumulation for its own sake, where wealth was not to be enjoyed in consumption but reinvested and increased, with the process of accumulation itself becoming a kind of religious devotion. Whether or not Weber's specific historical thesis is correct, he identified something important about the cultural transformation that allowed market society to flourish. The development of a moral framework that legitimized and even sanctified the relentless pursuit of economic gain. The rise of consumer culture in the 20th century marked another major transformation in how greed operates socially. The development of modern advertising, the creation of consumer credit systems, the deliberate cultivation of fashion and obsolescence. All of these represented systematic efforts to stimulate desire and encourage consumption. The sociologist Zygmunt Bauman described the shift from producer capitalism, which needed workers who were disciplined and restrained in consumption so they would save for the future, to consumer capitalism, which needs consumers who are impulsive and never satisfied, always ready to purchase the next new product. In consumer society, identity itself becomes tied to consumption patterns. We express who we are through what we buy, and we're encouraged to constantly remake ourselves through new purchases. The old question, how much is enough, becomes almost nonsensical in a cultural context where the entire system depends on the answer always being more. The concentration of wealth at the top of society has accelerated dramatically in recent decades, creating levels of inequality not seen since the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. In the United States, the share of wealth held by the top 1% has nearly doubled since 1980, while wages for most workers have stagnated when adjusted for inflation. This extreme inequality is both a consequence of greed, as those with power and capital have shaped rules and policies to favor further accumulation, and a driver of greed, as the gap between rich and poor creates intensified status, anxiety, and desire to climb the ladder. Looking at historical case studies provides vivid illustration of how greed has shaped human events and the suffering it has caused. The period known as the Gilded Age in the United States, roughly from the 1872 to the early 1900s, saw the rise of industrial titans who accumulated unprecedented fortunes. John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J. P. Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt. These men built vast business empires in oil, steel, banking, and railroads, often through ruthless competitive practices, political manipulation, and the exploitation of workers who labored in dangerous conditions for minimal wages. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, for instance, used aggressive tactics to drive competitors out of business, securing secret rebates from railroads and temporarily lowering prices below cost to eliminate rivals before raising them again. The result was not just personal wealth on a scale never before seen, but also tremendous social costs, child labor, industrial accidents, polluted cities, the breaking of strikes with private armed forces, and state violence. What's interesting about some of these robber barons, as they were called, is that they wrestled with the meaning and responsibility of their wealth, particularly later in life. Andrew Carnegie wrote an essay called The Gospel of Wealth, in which he argued that rich people had a moral obligation to use their fortunes for the public good, rather than passing them to heirs. He and Rockefeller became major philanthropists, founding libraries, universities, and medical research institutions. This raises complex questions about whether late-life generosity absolves or compensates for earlier exploitation, whether the system that allowed such concentration of wealth should be celebrated because it enabled eventual philanthropy, or condemned because it required exploitation in the first place. The debate continues today with modern billionaires who amass enormous fortunes and then pledge to give much of it away. Colonialism provides perhaps the most devastating historical example of greed's consequences on a global scale. European powers, driven by the desire for resources, trade routes, and wealth, conquered and exploited vast territories across the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. The transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly transported millions of Africans to the Americas, was an enterprise driven fundamentally by greed, the desire to profit from plantation agriculture producing sugar, tobacco, and cotton, the extraction of silver from mines in Bolivia and Mexico, worked by indigenous people under brutal conditions, enriched Spain while decimating indigenous populations. The opium trade, where British merchants grew opium in India and forced it onto Chinese markets, created millions of addicts and provoked wars when Chinese authorities tried to stop the flow, all in the service of British commercial interests. The colonization of the Congo under King Leopold II of Belgium resulted in millions of deaths as the territory was ruthlessly exploited for rubber and other resources. These are not abstract historical events, but direct consequences of human greed institutionalized and empowered through technological and military advantage. More recently, the financial crisis of 2008 provides a case study in how greed, combined with complex financial systems and inadequate regulation, can create catastrophe. The crisis had multiple causes, but a central factor was the behavior of financial institutions that aggressively promoted subprime mortgages to borrowers who couldn't afford them, then packaged these risky loans into complex securities that were sold to investors around the world. Traders and executives were incentivized with huge bonuses tied to short-term profits, encouraging them to take enormous risks with other people's money. When the housing bubble burst, millions of people lost their homes. Retirement savings were devastated. Unemployment soared, and the global economy entered the worst recession since the Great Depression. Meanwhile, many of the executives whose decisions had contributed to the crisis walked away with their bonuses intact, and the largest financial institutions were bailed out with taxpayer money because they were deemed too big to fail. The crisis revealed how greed at the top of the economic system, especially when combined with the ability to offload risk onto others, can have devastating consequences for ordinary people. Literature and mythology have long grappled with greed as a theme, offering stories that capture its psychology and consequences with vivid power. The myth of King Midas, who wished that everything he touched would turn to gold, perfectly illustrates the danger of getting what you wish for when your wishes are driven by greed. Midas finds that he cannot eat or drink, and when he touches his beloved daughter, she too becomes gold. The gift he thought he desired becomes a curse, and he must beg the gods to remove it. This ancient story captures the insight that greed destroys the real goods of life, that in pursuing gold we may lose what truly matters. Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, with its portrait of Ebenezer Scrooge, explores the psychological and social costs of avarice. Scrooge has accumulated wealth by being hard-hearted, underpaying his clerk, refusing charity, isolating himself from human warmth. The story shows how greed impoverishes not just its victims but the greedy person himself, making Scrooge miserable and alone. His transformation after being visited by ghosts involves not just generosity with money, but a reopening of his heart to connection, joy, and care for others. In Dante's Divine Comedy, the greedy are punished in the fourth circle of hell, divided into hoarders and wasters, eternally pushing heavy weights against each other, forever in conflict, forever unsatisfied. In the fifth circle, the wrathful fight on the surface of the river Styx, while the sullen lie beneath it, and Dante suggests connections between greed and wrath, between excessive attachment to material things and the anger that arises when we don't get what we want, or when others threaten what we have. Medieval and Renaissance art frequently depicted the deadly sins, including greed, often represented by figures clutching bags of gold or surrounded by possessions. These artistic representations served as moral instruction, reminding viewers of the spiritual dangers of excessive attachment to earthly treasures. Contemporary scientific research has added new dimensions to our understanding of greed by examining its neurological basis and its effects on behavior with experimental precision. Neuroscientists using brain imaging have identified the reward circuitry involved in the processing of monetary gains and losses. The nucleus accumbens, a structure deep in the brain associated with reward and pleasure, shows increased activity in anticipation of monetary gain. The prefrontal cortex, involved in decision-making and self-control, modulates these reward signals. Individuals vary in the strength of these signals and in the effectiveness of prefrontal control, which helps explain differences in susceptibility to greedy behavior. There's also evidence that chronic stress and exposure to scarcity can alter the functioning of these circuits, making people more impulsive and more focused on immediate rewards, which can trap people in poverty by making it harder to delay gratification and save for the future. Behavioral economics, a field that combines psychological insights with economic analysis, has documented numerous ways in which human decision-making departs from the rational self-interest assumed by classical economic theory. People often act in ways that appear irrational from a purely self-interested perspective, such as punishing those who act unfairly even at a cost to themselves, or cooperating in situations where defection would bring higher personal payoffs. At the same time, people can be influenced toward more selfish behavior by contextual factors. Experiments have shown that studying economics itself, with its emphasis on self-interested rational actors, can make students more likely to act selfishly in experimental games. This suggests that our economic theories and institutions don't just describe human nature but actively shape it. That when we build systems premised on greed and teach people that self-interest is rational and expected, we may be creating more greedy behavior than would otherwise exist. Research on wealth and empathy has produced disturbing findings about how having money affects psychology. Studies by Paul Piff and colleagues at UC Berkeley found that wealthier individuals were more likely to cut off other drivers at intersections, less likely to stop for pedestrians at crosswalks, more likely to cheat in games, and more likely to take candy from a jar designated for children. In laboratory experiments, participants who were randomly assigned to feel wealthy through manipulations like being given more money in a game or being asked to imagine winning the lottery, subsequently displayed less empathy and more entitled behavior. This research suggests that wealth itself, regardless of individual personality, may trigger psychological changes that make people more self-focused and less concerned with others, which in turn can create a feedback loop where the wealthy accumulate more while feeling increasingly entitled to it and less obligated to share. The role of technology in modern greed deserves particular attention. Digital platforms and algorithms have created new mechanisms for stimulating and exploiting acquisitive desires. Online shopping with one-click purchasing removes friction from buying decisions, making impulse purchases easier. Recommendation algorithms are optimized to keep users engaged and to encourage purchases, learning individual vulnerabilities and preferences with uncanny precision. Mobile games employ psychological techniques borrowed from gambling to encourage compulsive play and in-app purchases. Social media platforms profit from showing users content that provokes strong emotions, including envy, which drives engagement and creates opportunities for advertising. The attention economy treats human awareness itself as a resource to be extracted and monetized, with companies competing to capture as much of our mental space as possible. This represents a new frontier of greed, where the target is not just our money, but our time, attention, and psychological well-being. Cryptocurrency and NFTs have created new forms of speculative mania, with people rushing to invest in digital assets, whose value is often purely based on what someone else will pay for them, hoping to get rich quickly. The rhetoric around these technologies often emphasizes decentralization and liberation from traditional financial systems, but much of the actual participation appears driven by the age-old hope of easy wealth. The environmental consequences of cryptocurrency mining, which consumes enormous amounts of electricity, illustrates how greed can drive behavior with devastating externalities, where private gain comes at the cost of public welfare. The feedback loops of wealth inequality deserve careful examination. When wealth is highly concentrated, those at the top have enormous power to shape the rules of the game in their favor, lobbying for tax cuts, deregulation, and policies that allow further accumulation. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where wealth generates power, generates more wealth. At the same time, those struggling with economic insecurity may become more focused on material concerns out of necessity, while also being subjected to intense marketing and social pressures to consume. The wealthy can afford to be philosophical about money because they have it. The poor may think about money constantly, not because they're greedy, but because they're struggling to survive. This raises important questions about how much of what we call greed is driven by genuine insecurity, and how much by psychological factors that operate independently of material need. As we draw these many threads together, what can we say about why humans are so greedy? The answer is complex and multifaceted, involving biology, psychology, culture, history, and social structure. At the biological level, we carry within us ancient motivations that served our ancestors well in environments of scarcity, but that can drive endless accumulation in environments of abundance. Our brains are wired to respond to rewards, to compare ourselves with others, to feel loss more intensely than gain, and to quickly adapt to improvements in our circumstances, always becoming ready to desire the next thing. These are not moral failings, but features of our cognitive architecture, though recognizing them as such doesn't make them any less problematic in their consequences. At the psychological level, greed often stems from insecurity, from a feeling of lack that we attempt to fill with external things. The person who feels inadequate may seek validation through accumulation. The person who feels unsafe may seek security through wealth. The person who feels meaningless may seek purpose through achievement and success. But because material things cannot actually address these deeper needs, the strategy fails, leading to more acquisition in a futile attempt to satisfy a hunger that isn't really about material things at all. The great paradox of greed is that it promises satisfaction while ensuring dissatisfaction, offering fulfillment while delivering emptiness. At the cultural and philosophical level, we've seen how human wisdom traditions across the globe have recognized greed as a problem and have developed sophisticated frameworks for understanding and constraining it. Yet we've also seen how modern economic systems and consumer culture have worked to undermine these traditional restraints, creating institutional structures and cultural narratives that encourage and reward acquisitive behavior. We live in a civilization that simultaneously condemns greed as a vice and celebrates it as a virtue, that tells us money can't buy happiness while organizing most of life around its pursuit. At the social and political level, greed is not just an individual psychological phenomenon but a systemic feature of how power and resources are distributed. The inequality we see in the world is not simply the result of some people being greedier than others, but of structures that enable and reward accumulation by those already wealthy, while limiting opportunities for those born into poverty. Addressing greed in any meaningful way requires not just individual moral reform, but collective action to create more just and equitable systems. So why are humans so greedy? Perhaps the question itself needs reframing. We might instead ask, under what conditions does the human capacity for accumulation, which served legitimate purposes in our evolutionary past, and which still serves legitimate purposes in providing security and comfort, transform into something excessive and destructive? The answer seems to be that it transforms when we lose sight of sufficiency, when we lack meaningful social bonds and purposes beyond acquisition, when we live in systems of extreme inequality that create status, anxiety, and alienation, when we're constantly exposed to messages telling us we need more, when we don't have cultural and spiritual resources that can provide meaning beyond material success. The ancient wisdom traditions we explored were not naive about human nature. They recognized that the pull of desire is strong, that we're all vulnerable to greed, but they believed that we're capable of something more. That through philosophy, spiritual practice, social connection, and properly structured institutions, we can live with enough rather than always needing more. Perhaps what they understood and what we've forgotten is that the question isn't whether we can eliminate acquisitive desires entirely. It's whether we can keep them in proportion, subordinated to other values and goals that bring genuine fulfillment. As you lie here now, perhaps drifting towards sleep, consider your own relationship with wanting and having. What are you really seeking when you desire more? What would enough look like? What matters more than accumulation? These are not easy questions, and they're not meant to induce guilt, but rather reflection. We're all embedded in systems and cultures that shape our desires in powerful ways, and simply recognizing these forces is itself a kind of freedom. The greedy impulse is human, but so is the capacity for contentment, generosity, and wisdom. So is the ability to find joy in simple things, to treasure relationships more than possessions, to measure a life by something other than what was accumulated. Thank you for spending this time exploring this ancient and modern question with me. Whether you've listened to every word or drifted in and out of sleep, whether this has raised new questions or simply given you something to ponder, I'm grateful for your presence. If you found value in this journey through history, philosophy, and human nature, consider subscribing to hear more explorations of the big questions that have puzzled humanity across time. But for now, let these thoughts settle into the background as your mind turns toward rest. The question of why we're greedy will still be there tomorrow, but right now, there's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to acquire, nothing you need to prove. You have enough. You are enough. Rest well.